We're talking today with Mr. Alton Sheridan of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. And Mr. Sheridan, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in Allendale Township in January 7, 1925. Okay. On a farm. It was an interesting place because my ancestors on both sides, the one came over on the Mayflower, by the way, interested where there came as early settlers in Allendale, because Allendale was covered with woods, and until the woods was cut, then the farm was bought, and so this farm was a farm that was a result of that. But all the neighbors by then were Dutch because they had bought up all those farms became available. Okay. And so then I got a deferment for a year.
Okay. Let's back up a little bit. How large was the farm?
80 acres.
Okay. And did your family manage to hang on to it in the Depression?
Yes.
Okay. And so what was life when you were a kid in the 1930s during the Depression? What was that like for you?
Well, basically, we did a lot of what people would call truck gardening, raised a lot of fruit and vegetables. And so hoeing was a big issue. And my dad went to the Grand Rapids market, the farmer's market. And so for a while he had hired two men to fill in because we had a lot of work to do, even though it was not a large farm, because we were in the small vegetable and fruit business. And so he went to the market, and then he hired people. And back then you could hire a man for $25 a month, and you had to give him the room and board and so forth. But for a lot of people that was important. Okay.
Now, because of the kind of farming he was doing, it was easier to get money on a regular basis, so you could...
Well, we had kept about 12 to 14 cows. 200 to 300 chickens, and so from that standpoint, and some hogs. So we were a regular farm, we got a milk check. But then when you went to the market, by whatever you sold, that was the money you got. Okay. And so that kind of kept things going. And then, so as a result, they decided that they no longer could hire anybody because there were jobs began as the war came.
Okay.
In 41. And but not being able to hire people, then they tried to convince me to take a deferment, or a farm deferment. And I took a farm deferment for a year with the understanding that that was it, and I was going to join.
Okay. Now, to back up a little bit, before Pearl Harbor happened, were you paying any attention to what was happening in the world? You know, there was a war going on in Europe, that kind of thing?
Yeah, quite a bit, because we were always took to Grand Rapids Press, which is not like it is today. And and my parents were interested, and so we discussed things going on.
And did you finish high school, by the way?
Yes, I finished high school in 42.
Right. Now, do you remember how you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Well, we always went to church morning and evening, and we didn't listen to the radio. We had to milk the cows and so on. And then when we got to church, then some people mentioned it because they had had the radio on. So that was how we found out about Pearl Harbor, was secondhand, if you will.
Right.
People at church.
Okay. And you mentioned then that particularly once the war had started, it was hard to find any men to help work on the farm. Right. And so you did. Now, did you have any brothers or sisters?
I had two younger brothers.
Okay.
One was 4 years younger than I was, and the other one was 6 years younger.
Okay, so there was a limit to how much they could do to help
Right,
at that point.
right.
Yeah, okay. Now,
They
you
were
just,
expected to hold like everybody else.
okay. Now, if you had wanted to, could you have kept your deferment longer?
Yes, I could. We had enough produce when processed that we was equal to 3 people, so we could have had 2 deferments for thing.
Okay.
But my father had left his father to go to World War I, and so he was not in position to tell me I couldn't go or shouldn't go.
Okay. So basically, you let the deferment expire, and then you just let Uncle Sam call you.
Right, and what you did was they said you volunteered for enlistment.
Right.
And, so you just said, I'm no longer want my
Right.
deferment. And, so I think my deferment was good through, I agreed to stay through the summer where the main demand would be.
Right.
And then, so then in August, I signed that, turned in my deferment and said I'm going to be subject to the draft.
All right. And then when did you start training?
So then I went, and November, I think 14, then I went to Fort Sheridan. Well, I'd previously gone to Ohio, or to Detroit to get my physical.
Right.
And then I went to Fort Sheridan, and from there to Camp Robinson, Arkansas.
All right. Is that where you did your basic training?
And did my basic training. And,
How did they get you from Chicago down to Arkansas?
on a train.
Okay. And what was that train ride like?
Nobody knew what was going on, where they were going or anything. Back then, they didn't want to tell anybody where they was going because they thought maybe the 5th columnists would. And so we were, had no idea where we were going. Ended up in Little Rock, and Kent Joseph E. Robinson was a post there, fort, and it was a temporary World War II completely, and so therefore you didn't even know it existed, until you got there. So.
Okay. Now, what was the training experience like? What did you do?
Well, this is, I'll just go through a little, it's interesting. The attempt was theory, and see, a lot of this I get because I went to a lot of schools after this, was the idea was that rather than, and had been traditionally the method, you leave a division until they get pretty mauled, and therefore cannot continue, and then you bring in another division to replace them, pull them out, refill them with fresh people, go through some training, and then they'll be ready to go back.
Okay.
But the IRTC was on the theory that if we leave the division in place and replace people one by one, then we can not have this trouble of replacing a couple of, or one division replacing another, which is not an easy task because one division is leaving, the other one's taking their place. If you get the enemy comes at you, then you're in bad shape because you're really not organized to fight. And so the idea was that if they went to this business of individuals, well,
So
two
what
per
does
company is fine, but when you lose 50 from a company, then sending in 50 brand new young kids and old men, because mind to say, the people that I was near the end of World War II. In the South particularly, because a lot of their people left, the 30 census basically determined the number of young men that were in each county. A lot of the county was in pretty good shape because they had a lot of people coming in to work in Kent and Muskegon County. But some of those southern counties, their young men all left, but they still had a quota to fill. And you had to have that quota and you had to send them in, so there's some pretty sorry looking people.
Okay, so what does IRTC stand for?
Individual Replacement Training Center.
Okay, so the idea was, so there was basically a unit that was in place that had a cadre or a corps of trainers who stayed, and then
They were fighting, they were in Europe fighting, and you'd be sent directly to
Okay.
replace those people who, so two guys got killed or something.
Okay, so this particular training center was geared toward a particular unit that was serving.
No, just
Just general replacements. Okay,
general.
right.
And
Okay.
then these people would be sent to Europe and then distributed.
Okay,
there.
okay. Hey, we're training as a replacement. All right.
Yeah.
But so now describe a little bit the actual training that you received.
Yeah, it was supposedly trained you to be an infantryman. And so you had basically, how you operate in the Army, which is the #1 issue. And then you had training rifle, some mortar, and a few other things, because you didn't know what you'd end up being when you ended up in that point. Because remember, this is the time of the we were in training, the bulge happened. And the unit that was next to us, that was 2 weeks from finishing their training, was pulled off their training, sent home for a week, and flown across and they were in the front line. Some of those people hadn't been in the Army 14 weeks, and they were in the front lines.
All right.
With no training, with only just that basic.
Okay. Yeah. How long was basic training supposed to last?
It was supposed to last 16 weeks when I was in, and then they cut it back to 12, and then they raised it up again. And
Okay.
so,
Now, how much emphasis was there on discipline?
pretty strong. I'll get to that to another further along.
Okay. All right. Now, you mentioned that some of the people coming in were not very well qualified.
Right.
So what kind of problems did they have?
The kind of problem that if you saw one of them, you wanted to be behind him, not in front of him, because you didn't know what he'd do. And there was one boy from Arkansas that played Ernest Tubbs. He had a portable photograph he had. Every morning he'd put that on, but they were just, and some of them had very little education or information, anything, and they just, I remember this one, this is an interesting one. If you didn't get a haircut, if you shaved your neck, had somebody shave your neck, you might be able to get by, because you look pretty good. This guy shaved his own neck, one up here, one down here. Needless to say, he was in trouble. But, and then we had like a man who was 35 years old, had 4 children, had been a state policeman in Indiana and was drafted. And so we had the combination of 17 and 18-year-olds for the most part, and whoever they'd skimmed out of the top of the heap again that they could, that whose jobs had disappeared or something, and so they were eligible to be called.
Well, they raised the draft age a couple of times, and so it got fairly high, so this guy would have been deferred earlier, but not anymore.
Yeah, not the same. When you're into 44, you're into, and most of the people were people who had graduated from high school that June, and in November they were already in the Army.
Okay. Now, how long did you wind up staying there?
Well, I was there for the month. I think we were on a 16-week.
Okay.
And I was there for 14 weeks, and then I got called off. and said, you're going to the University of West Virginia.
All right.
So,
And why was that happening?
I think it was, I had 2 years of college in. I had gone to an interesting program at Grand Rapids JC that Dow Chemical and the University of Michigan and Grand Rapids JC worked out. You took most of your chemistry, physics, and math in your first 2 years, and then Dow would hire you. And because you, for all practical purposes, you had almost as much chemistry as a bachelor's degree. And then they would help people get, and the University of Michigan would improve, would try to help you get your degree. In the meantime, you can be working, because remember, this is, a lot of these people really didn't have anything. They went to JC because it was a cheap place to go, and that was a different place than colleges today, because there were people there who were really struggling to get ahead, not because academically, but because just financially difficult to go. So this was set up as an attempt to give Dow a bunch of chemists at a lower rate than they really, because during the war they used high school students. But just to give an example, if you were pulling this sample and it turned brown instead of supposed to turn green, the high school student would know it didn't pass. The chemist would know, hey, I know what's happening. We better put X, Y, and Z into this batch to keep it from coagulating. And so that was, that was to their advantage. They hired, bachelor's degree chemists to do ordinary work. But if you saved the $40,000 worth batch, why, the money was well spent.
Right. Okay, so you had some background. Now, explain what program it is that you're going into. What was it called?
Well, this was the engineer. Basically, ASTP provided dentists, doctors, and engineers were their main attempt.
Well, one branch of it also trained pilots and flight officers, because they were also, people who did that also went to ASTP. I think some of them did.
Well,
Or there was another version of going to college for them.
yeah, but that
different
wasn't
label.
really the ASTP.
Okay, so ASTP was more technical specialization.
Yeah,
Okay.
and one of the little ditties was, take down your service flag, mother, your son's in the ASTP.
All right.
So
Now,
it was basically more for the medical and, because I had some friends from JC that were headed for medical school or dental school, and they went on to, and because of that time, 2 years was enough if you had good grades. 2 years you could enter dental or medical school. And I knew some people that they were put in the reserve, but they were basically it was the STP program, because the government was concerned that if you ended up with a long war and a shortage of medical and engineers, you'd have some real problems.
okay, so you were essentially training to be an engineer. That
Right.
was the idea. But now, but you're going to college.
Right.
Okay, and why were they sending you to college?
Well, because they thought the start of the ASTP was to provide engineers, doctors,
Right.
and that. And so by the time I went, I think it was more to save their neck in terms of West Virginia University. They probably had signed a contract or something, and so they decided to go one more term and put people in because the need to send somebody to 3 more years of college or 4 years of college or whatever was no longer important. And by the time, and while I was at West Virginia University, the war was was over in Europe,
Mhm.
and so we were no longer needed in the STP. So at that point, then they sent us all into what was called ASTP, and that was Advanced Training Program.
All right. Now, before that, talk a little bit about being at West Virginia. What was life like during that term?
Well, we were in a typical dorm, so to speak, with 3 or 4 people in an area, and so you just but you marched to classes and everything, and then you had the course, and it was supposedly increased, and so I fitted in pretty well because it was like I was in the middle of the thing, because I had plenty of math and physics and chemistry, so I got advanced math and some more drawing and things like that engineers get. So it was.
Yeah. Now, how many credit hours did you take? Do you know how many classes you were taking at once?
Well, it was probably equal to about 20 hours.
Okay, so that's a lot.
Yeah.
All right. Did you have any?
And then you were tied down completely except for the weekend.
Mhm.
And in the weekend you could have sign out if you wanted to. And of course, the person in charge of the Army was some big old fat master sergeant that wasn't good for anything else, so they put him in charge of the ASTP unit. So, and so it kind of, you could see it, you could begin to see it disintegrating, So at the end of the term, and it was on kind of a term rather than a semester
Right.
basis. So at the end of the term, well, then you shipped off. A few people stayed there. They had sorted again through some of them that were closer to being finished. I think stayed.
Okay.
And then we went to this advanced. Well, the advanced training program was an attempt to take people who had been in the States during the war and then give them this same training basically we got, only it was shorter because you didn't get the discipline, you didn't get any orientation at all. But it was an attempt to take those people and train them as replacements, because you're going to need a lot of replacements for Japan at that point in time, and it was the Army push.
Now, where were you doing this advanced training?
In Fort Shelby, Mississippi.
Okay. What was that like?
Well, about 30% or more of the fellows were what were called, I don't know where the term came from, but they were called Green Barracks boys. They were people who had gone AWOL and then other problems, had served time, and then were going to be, well, about 15% of them never even showed up. They just, as soon as they got finished out of the Green Barracks, wherever that was, the military prison, if you will, then they just went home and didn't bother to come. And then first week or two, and then you lost quite a few more. They'd been there a week, and they decided they didn't like that, so they went home. And they were just completely useless bunch of people. The sergeant would call cadence to get people in step, and this whole bunch of people would immediately change the other steps so they'd be out of step. And one time, the poor sergeant made the mistake of saying left, to turn left, and he should have said right. And so these guys and because he went to the end, and then the other people were people picked up. For instance, there was a sergeant and a corporal and I think a staff sergeant that had spent the war training West Pointers on tank usage. They were tankers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they got rid of them because you had people that had been in combat with tanks. You didn't need these. So they sent them to this advanced training to become an infantryman.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody was designed because that was basically everything was filled except for infantry.
Right.
And so anybody that you got while they were headed to the infantry. But then once people got to where they were going to be distributed, whether it was overseas or whatever, then you went into anything. So a couple of people that I kept contact with from Ottawa County, one went to the Philippines and had a job in an office of some kind, and the other one went to Germany, and by the time he got over there, the war was over, and then he was in a supplies unit or something, so it was typical at that point. But you see, the group that was next to us that got sent overseas, those poor devils were sent over there and not been in the army maybe 14 weeks, and then they were in a foxhole with somebody. And
Well, that was
it doesn't work because you can't trust the fellow you're with, and he can't trust you. And so on paper, the Army thought they had a wonderful solution to the problem, but it doesn't work. Because at the same time, there were divisions in the United States who had been training for 2 years and never passed the requirement that was to become a combat unit. They were turned down, told them they need more training, and whether it was their officers or whatever. But anyway, you had this group of people that had been training for 2 years in the government and the U.S. and didn't go overseas, and then you're taking young kids with 14 weeks of training and sending them overseas.
Okay. But now those were the ones who were with you in Arkansas who got sent over. Now we're at Camp Shelby in Mississippi and are getting right down to the end of the war.
Right.
So probably from there, nobody is going to fight.
No, well, you still were facing the Japanese.
Right. When did you finish then at Camp Shelby?
And so I finished Camp Shelby, I don't know what the time was, but then I was sent to Fort in Maryland. And
There's Fort Meade.
Fort Meade, right. And then to go over, assumed I would go to Europe, see. Because remember, all of this time, there's these people with the points that are coming home. And so they keep plugging these people in, not because they're casualties, but because they're points.
Right.
And so then I was sent to New Orleans, and there was a banana warehouse down there that the Army had gotten because they weren't shipping any bananas. And they, huge, 200 people in one room, and just mock cots on. And then eventually we got a ship came, and then we went to Panama.
Okay.
And it was that, I think they decided that mess at Camp Shelby with all of those Green Barracks boys and so forth, and all of these people, because you had all ranks, and you had sergeants and everything, because what are you going to do with them? They don't have enough points to get out, so what you're going to do is get the guy with the points and send him home and send those people over to Del. And so it was not a very good idea, but what else do you do?
Okay. So you get, as far as Panama, do you know when you arrived in Panama? Was the war still on at that point?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the war was still on in Japan.
Right.
And say, being in Panama was interesting because you had some people leaving Europe, I'm talking about infantry divisions, were sent through the Panama Canal
Right.
to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Some people came to the United States, got a little leave, and then were getting ready to go to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And these people that were going through Panama were not too happy because they knew that some people were getting a furlough and they weren't.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, and the Panama group, infantry, if I can digress in, because that was when he ended up in Panama. I ended up in an infantry. That was a unit, kind of a quasi thrown together of some tanks and infantry and everything else. Now, one interesting thing that was said about Panama was that when the war broke out, the general in charge of Panama was told the same thing that the people were told in Pearl Harbor, not to send any planes out.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, if I'm going to be held responsible, then I'm going to do what I think is necessary to maintain that responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So he was sending sorties out 750 miles from the canal on a regular basis. So if they had done the same thing in Pearl Harbor, they'd have picked up the Japanese ships
Mm-hmm.
a long time. Now the question comes, was that, some people claim the bigwigs wanted to get into a war and didn't want them flying from.
Yeah, well, that's the conspiracy theory version,
Right.
and the historians have pretty thoroughly debunked that. But that was the kind of thing that one hears. But regardless, orders like that did go out because they didn't want to provoke the Japanese.
Right.
But in his case, he chose to kind of do things his own way instead.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, by the time you got there, but you're not being sent through the canal, you're being sent to the canal zone
Right.
to join a unit there.
Right.
Okay. And what was the purpose or the function of that unit?
Well, first of all, number one is protect the canal.
Mhm.
And originally it was interesting because as late as 39 and 40, they were building huge coastal artillery units. They had big guns, huge guns that went down like that. And when they fired, they went up and fired and went behind a big wall so that theoretically they couldn't hit them coming. Well, that was fighting the last wars.
Right.
Because by that time, airplanes had become important and there was going to be an attack. But that Panama, because I worked for the head of the fire department, and he was a lieutenant colonel, and he had his tech sergeant working with him, because we had this big, huge room, and all of the people that were in charge of various things had a desk, and then you had an enlisted person beside you who did your typing, answered your phone, and all of that. Well, the fellow that was working for the colonel there, by then he was given majors. When the war broke out, he was head of the fire department in Panama, and he was commissioned a major and put in charge of all of it. And so we went to and so in the process, well, they just decided that they would integrate the civilian and the military fire departments. And at one time, there was one area, it was in a black, because Panama was segregated, and you had terms that you had to learn. One was the gold and silver. The black folks got paid in silver money. The white folks got paid in gold money. And so, so I might say it's a silver drinking fountain, rather than This is the black folks drink.
Mhm.
It was a silver drink. And the church service, let's say, for the, could be for the insulars, because we had a lot of Puerto Ricans. They sent a lot of Puerto Ricans to Panama because they speak Spanish. And, or continentals. So continentals meant you were from the U.S. proper, and insular meant you were Puerto Rican. Doesn't tell you any place that that's what it is, but the church service is for continentals, or church service for. So then he decided, this colonel decided that we would. I was sent to this unit. First, I went to the unit. Everybody said, "Don't volunteer for anything in the army." And I said, "Well, it can't be much worse than this infantry outfit." Because every morning you had to fall out and you had to lift up your foot, because they had an X on one pair of shoes and an O on the other pair. And then you had to lace up the shoes and put them under your bed. But you had to change every day, which for foot rot, what have you. And so they'd walk behind you and see that everybody had O's on the old day, had X on their shoes on the odd days. So anyway, it was kind of a crappy place. And I remember some old sergeant saying, "Well, some of you guys really mind your business, you might get to be PFC." But the job basically consisted of walking along the ship. Now the ship is going through the canal. This is at the locks, not the rest of the place. But it's going through the locks. You walk along the ship, and then you turn and walk back along the ship, and then until the ship gets through the locks, and then you take another ship. You had a couple of people on each side of the ship, and I guess they were supposed to holler help if something happened.
Right. So it's pretty dull and.
Right.
Okay. So how did you wind up then assigned to the fire department?
Well, because the colonel put out a request that anybody wanted to volunteer for the fire department, they were willing. So, and you know, the typical military thing, well, don't volunteer for anything. Well, that was the best volunteer I ever made.
Okay.
So we ended up going to this. I was on the Pacific side originally, and then the fire station I was assigned to was on the Atlantic side. So put your foot locker in the truck, and so a couple of us went. And next morning we got the colonel, the sergeant who was in charge of this fire station. We were standing around outside, and pretty soon this captain comes along, and nobody hollers us you know, attention and all. And he just walks up and talks to the people. Coming from the infantry, this was a different phenomenon. And he never went in the barracks where we stayed. He'd wait outside till somebody showed up.
Okay.
He had been a fireman in New York City in civilian life. He was a coast artilleryman, but when they found out he had fire experience, so they put him in charge. He was in charge of the fire stations on the Atlantic side, and then the colonel was in charge of the
Okay. So he's just acting like he did back as a civilian, and he's not acting much like an officer.
Right.
Okay. All right. Now, what did your actual duties consist of then?
Well, at that point, they still believed in civilian did too, that you start the fire truck every morning to make sure it's going to run. Well, it's since been evidence improves that starting every morning doesn't prove it'll start the next morning any more than it left it alone. So, and drive it out, make sure it's clean, and then we'd do a little practice run, which is run out with the fire truck, grab the hose and wrap it around the fire plug so that you can hold it, and then the truck goes out, pulls the stuff. And being in the tropics, we didn't have any heaters, so there was no problem. Once in a while, we'd have a grass fire, or we would have a kitchen fire. And one of the things we learned in the kitchen fire is what they used for a foam was like a licorice material. And so if you spray that all over the stove, you don't get called again.
Because they couldn't get it off?
Took a long time to scrape all that old licorice burned onto the coal-fired stove, because they were coal-fired. But it was interesting in the infantry because they had, they fed you with tables, and they hired natives to bring the food out so that you served like it was family style rather than going through a line like typical military. I don't know what brought that on and why they did it, but you know, the table would fill up, and then this kid who was responsible for that table would bring the potatoes and the meat and other things, and then but then you took your dish when you're finished and took it over to get rid of it. But so that was a completely different, I don't know why. But then part of the time you had regular milk, and they'd ship it in, I guess, and sometimes you just had this made up from. So the first guy up in the morning would taste it and either holler out or else look on his face. So if it was dried milk watered down by it, none of it went. But so it was in the infantry where you just had that thing, and it was pretty much one of the things that they said was that, you know, so many important people had gone through the country that they through the canal, that they wanted to make sure, and so there were 3 units, and 2 would be guarding the canal, one on the locks, one on the Pacific, one on the Atlantic, and then one was off, and they were in training and so forth, and including every morning you had 2 hours of close order drill with the band playing. And one of the stories was, whether this is important, was that there were a lot of big shots come through, and they wanted to make it. In fact, we wore white gloves and the whole business. So it was interesting. But Panama was, in pre-World War II, was the best place to be stationed in the U.S. Army. And so, because the booze was cheap, women were available, and so it was a great place to be, old regular Army guys. And then at the end of the war, then there was an attempt to, a lot of people who re-enlisted for Panama, figuring that was the best place, but of course, compared to Japan or Germany, it wasn't, but on pre-World War I, that was what the thing was. But anyway, so then in the fire department, you had very little to do because in terms of fire, we did have one major fire, a Navy warehouse burned, and they had all the fire departments grass fire.
Mhm.
And then we backed up the aircraft, and also occasionally. And they had, when we went down there were P-38s, which were the two
Mhm.
ones. And then they traded them off, well, about the time of the, I suppose they were left over from Germany or something. They put in the P-47s,
Mhm.
and the P-47 was a P-38 is a triangle,
Mhm.
and gear, and the P-47 had a great big air-cooled engine in front,
Mhm.
and if that ran off the end of the runway, why the wheels would sink in and the thing would
Mhm.
flip over, and so then you had to try to get the pilot out because the canopy crashed down and so forth. So those were so we would always follow along in case there was a not too regular but an emergency. Somebody was, and then the old head of the Air Force, the general down there, and head of the Air Force, he couldn't get the landing gear down on his plane. So they told him to just, they knew there was a cleared path and told him to go take it and to bail out.
Mhm.
Well, he didn't have guts enough to bail out. So he kept on going until it ran out of gas and he ended up in a swamp. Luckily,
All right. Well, did they get him out?
yeah, I got him out okay. We were there soon because we happened to be, everybody was kind of on, wouldn't have been anything if he'd have jumped out, but
Mhm.
he wouldn't jump out, so.
All right. Now,
So much for the commander.
I guess so. Yeah. Now was this? Did you have sort of just a regular cycle or schedule, or did you have different shifts at different times that you had to work?
No, the Army's deal is that at that time, all firemen worked 48 and 24 off.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was pretty loosey-goosey because if somebody wanted to go to town, well, you just, you're going to be here, well, okay. But to fill in as long as you had a crew,
Mm-hmm.
full crew on the thing. So. And there were two old boys from West Virginia that they got a bottle of rum and they kept it in their boot because your boots were there so you could load up in a hurry, but they just wanted to be in sight, so they had it in the boot. And then they just stayed mellow, as I said. Never got drunk, never got sober. But whenever it ran out, one of them put on his Class A uniform and went to town and bought not two bottles, one bottle. And then came home and then they went through that. But these poor old West Virginians who wanted to fight, and they were shipped to Panama because they were a unit that was considered to be one of the best well-trained.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were concerned about Panama, so they sent them there. And I remember when the end of the European one, these poor old guys would say, just send us to Japan, let those guys stay here,
Mhm.
Never happened, so. And then they eventually, as I said, people started getting enough points because they'd been in since before the war started,
Mhm.
so that eventually most of them got sent home.
Now, did you go off base much, or did you go into the towns at all?
No, I didn't go much. Some people went on a regular basis. And they had for the colonel, they had a bunch of four-door sedans, 42 Fords, and the story was that they were on a ship headed for Peru,
Mm-hmm.
and the war broke out and the Army confiscated them. And they're all right-hand drives.
Mm-hmm.
And the colonel always insisted riding in the front seat instead of the back seat. So you pull up there and some new guy that didn't know at the gate, and then and then he had a little O that you put up in the front of the window so that he would know an officer was in the car. If an officer wasn't in, then he kept that down. So he'd see this officer in the car, and then he'd salute, and of course, the captain, the colonel is sitting over in what appeared to be the driver's side, you know. And so it's interesting to see somebody who decides to salute and then finds out it's a mistake and try to see how he some of them ease out of it, some of them drop out, you know. So then they decided that was about at the end. They decided to reorganize, and they developed a company, the engineer company of firefighters, and everybody was on detached service again like they were before, but now they had a captain who was in charge. He was an infantry captain, but he also had been a fireman in his civilian life. He was appointed, so then where I had been working with the colonel on the desk next to him, because I could type. One thing in the Army, if you type, you usually get a job. And so I worked with him, and then when they switched over, then I was made the first sergeant of the company, although I was a buck sergeant at the time. And so then I just get called up into the things that go, because then they put a limit on no promotions, because they were getting all these people that were coming in, because at the end of World War II, if you were an officer and wanted to enlist as a first three grader, you could enlist and some people thought that was a good deal, so they did. And then you had all these old timers that knew Panama was the best place to be. So they signed up for Panama instead of Japan or Germany.
Okay. Are there other particular things from the time in Panama that sort of stand out in your memory, either from being infantry or being in the fire department?
Well, I don't know what's
You were talking about at some point, were they testing gas or with the infantry?
Yeah, well, there were things in the infantry which were interesting, but I never was. The fire department was so much better but people don't know this, but for the most part, there are islands in this lake, Gatun Lake, where to go, and they decided to do a attempt to see what it would be like training people for mustard gas. And so they had this on this island so it wouldn't spread, and they got troops there. And then they spread this mustard gas. Well, you see, all you could say is when you saw it, if you were in combat and they spread mustard gas, I don't know whether you'd try to save your neck or whether you'd try to fight, because those people, a lot of the time, all they did is stand around with their gloves on, and they were trying to get them to do something, but they weren't going to take any chances. And I remember one guy had a big blister like that on it. He got a little drop of mustard gas on his hand, but it was an attempt to see if you could get, and of course they'd never tested the uniform, and they had the uniforms in World War II with a flap inside that mustard gas is miserable stuff, and so they thought they wanted to see what could you do, you know, and it was not very successful because everybody was trying to save their neck, and they didn't want any blisters.
Right. So they just stayed covered up and didn't move?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, and so some people wouldn't eat or peed their pants and so forth in order to, they wouldn't take any chances.
Okay. Now you wound up staying on active duty for less than a full 2 years. How did your active duty time come to an end? Did they just tell you we don't need you anymore, you can go home, or what happens?
Well, all these people were pouring in to live down there. So that notice came out that, I might say, we had fire departments down a long ways in Panama, up at David, which is the city just beyond the end, and we got some order that everybody had to have that paper in their hand by such and such. Well, we got to deal with the ones with direction, but up at David, so I had got a friend with me, and we went up with a Jeep up to David, because to meet that requirement, everybody had to have that thing by such and such a day. Had to do with the time when you were down. Well, the Army basically said by December, everybody, that was December 1946, that all these people with a certain number, and I don't remember whether it was 10 or something like that, would have to be discharged, or they'd have to re-enlist or whatever. And so that came along, and then, so they immediately in Panama, because they were getting overloaded with people. For instance, they didn't give any more promotions, and so the first sergeants came, and then they took over that fire. So they sent us home, because they said it had to be done by December. Well, you get at Fort Sheridan, and they said, you're not supposed to be here yet. You're due. This is in end of July. And I said, we don't know what else to do with you, so discharge it.
Okay.
Because Panama wanted to get rid of them because they were getting overloaded with people. And the theory was that, as the thing was worded, by December you'd be finished with all these people. But assuming that starting in July you'd get rid of it. And Panama just said everybody that was eligible by.
So rather than sending you out in smaller groups, everyone just goes.
Yeah, everything.
Okay. But on the other hand, the Army doesn't really have anything else to do with you for a few months, so they'll let you leave.
Right.
Okay.
So that was the thing. Now you see, if you were in Japan, then they had something for you to do. But in Panama, they didn't, because it was pretty well decided it was no threat anymore. So you don't, when you need the, and so because. I had, because I was in the fire department and worked for the colonel, I saw a lot of secret maps, which of course I wasn't secret qualified, but if you knew how many guns there were up on top of mountains all over Panama, if any plane had ever shown up, as people said, if it ever shows up, you better find yourself indoors deep, because there's going to be so much flak falling down, you'll get killed just standing out in the open. And I knew that. But see, that was one of the things that was miserable. These poor guys, you're up on top of them, you got a searchlight, and you get the message turned on, and at night you can see what any kind of plane going over there. That was the practice, was to there'd be 6 searchlights on it, and then it'd get hit, and then another one would pick it up, and one would drop it off, and they'd clear across. This thing is just lighted up with probably 5, 6, 7 searchlights on it all the while. And but if you were in one of those units, you're up on top of a mountain. You have a truck delivers food to you once a week. You have to go down and walk down to get it because the truck can't come up into the top. And so you're 6 guys sitting up on top of this mountain with nothing going on except now and then searchlight, or if you had to be called to attention with the bow, with the gun, but you didn't fire it. You had to be ready to. And you know, you talk about a miserable job, and that was it. And it was just.
All right. Okay. Well, this tape is up, so we're gonna pause. All right. Now, in your story, you've gotten to the point where you've reached the end of your enlistment, your discharge in 1946. Once you officially were out of the Army, what did you do then?
Well, it was July much sooner than I had thought, because it's, you know, I thought I'd probably get out in November by then. And so I thought, well, in the meantime, I thought, well, maybe I'll just become a teacher. And I had the physics and math and chemistry. So I decided, and I kind of wanted to stay at home rather than going off someplace. And so, because when I went to JC, I commuted. We lived a mile north of the M45, and I walked out each morning, got a ride with a guy that had a job in Grand Rapids, and I came back with him to there and walked home again. And but then when we were what was I going to say? Anyway, then when we decided to go to JC, to Calvin, then those guys started running an old bus, old beat up bus he bought somewhere. And he ran that for a while from downtown Allendale, if you will.
So you went to Calvin to train as a teacher then?
Right.
Okay.
So then I went to Calvin to become a teacher. And then I got my master's degree from Michigan, and then got married, and then my wife taught in Lansing, and I went to Michigan State to get my doctorate.
Okay, so you just kept going to school. So you weren't teaching then, you were just...
No, I taught for 3 years.
Okay.
And then I went to Michigan State, because my wife in the meantime she had gone 2 years to college, and then her dad died and didn't have any money, and so she started teaching in a rural school, in Tuttle School, which is in northern out of Allendale. And then when they got married, and she finished her last semester at Calvin, and then got a job in Lansing.
Right.
So, and then I got my doctorate. And then I took a job at Case Western Reserve University, and mainly in supervision and administration. But I taught more than just the teachers. I had a lot of supervision courses, taught people in electrical companies and what have you that they did the course in supervision. So.
Okay. Now, were you in like a college of education, or were you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then they decided we were going to get a new head of the department, and everybody thought he was wonderful, and I thought, I don't know, I'm not gonna. So I had been kind of semi in charge, because they had taking the guy who was head of adult education, and then I worked with him. But anyway, so I was telling one of my colleagues, and he said, well, the National Education Association, I looked at a job there before I came here, and he said, maybe they'll have a job. So I contacted them, and so I went to work for NEA, and that was a great time. My daughter was in 6th grade, my son was in 8th grade. A great time to go to Washington. And then I was like 3 blocks north of White House. And so they'd ride in the summertime, they'd ride down with me, spend the whole day in one place at another. I mean, you spend years in Washington, just, you know, so they had a great opportunity to see a lot of the good stuff in Washington when we were there. So then, so I finished my career there, and my wife said that she'd got her doctorate at the University of Maryland in the meantime, and so she said, well, and she taught there a year, and it was when the hippies were, they'd come in and say, well, sorry, we missed class 2 times, but we had to go to New York to protest. And so that was an excuse. And so she went back to teaching 6th grade and had a lot of senators and representatives, kids.
Okay, so still doing that in Washington then. Okay, now you also, though, when you got out of the Army, you stayed in the reserves, though, right?
Right.
Okay, and then what did you do in the reserves?
Well, I stayed in the reserves and I joined well, first there was not much going on. I went to one, they had a summer camp for first 3 graders, and so I did that, and then I didn't do much there. And then I was a high school principal in Vicksburg, Michigan, and Kalamazoo had one of the, I can't say the name of it now, but anyway, a unit that's governmental unit for, and that was a paid unit, so I joined that, was in that for a few years, then I decided as a high school principal I wasn't going to get my dissertation written, so I better go back to, so I took a job at Holt and then finished my degree. So then I was in Lansing, and I joined a unit there of engineers, because engineers are not too common, and one of the problems is that engineers tend to move a lot, so you don't get this stability in the unit like you get some of the other ones. And this one guy he was a Civil War butt of the first order. So some of our programs were more Civil War than they were. It had an engineer effect. So then I decided, I had just gotten a direct commission. I didn't have it. So I had to get my basic officer's course and the advanced course. Well, it's hard to find an engineer course like that. Because the interesting thing is that a lot of engineers who are reservists go full-time for the advanced course. Because if you take the advanced course in engineering in the Army, you can pass the professional exam, almost guaranteed you can pass the professional exam. So they would go on active duty for long enough to get their advanced course.
Right.
But I took an infantry because I was combat engineer, and combat engineers are trained as infantry so that they can, and they're assigned in the old days M1 rifles rather than carbines. So you knew they were. So then I just took that, and then I go because those programs were year-round, go every night, and then once a week you went to the.
Okay, so you don't have to go to Fort Benning or someplace like that and do it full time.
No, because they had all these National Guard people, and they wanted them to get the training. Well, see, a lot of them couldn't, and so they provided this one night a week or a month, and then you went to Fort Benning for 2 weeks in the summer, and then over a period of 3 or 4 years, then you got your basic officer training, and then they had the advanced same thing. So I did the same thing in infantry, and then I went to command and general staff school, because by that time I was in Washington, and then there were opportunities there.
So you were there, so it was relatively convenient and
Yeah,
you
and
could do it.
then I went to did several things. They had the Armed Forces program that they do for, and it was at Fort McNair, but they had an evening program also, so I attended that. So it's called the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, which really helps you in terms of if you in dealing with a lot of military get involved in various kinds of things. So that's good. And then I took the program on logistics, and so I became a logistic qualified person. I didn't want to get involved in these paid things because they're, a lot of keeping you busy chasing your tail around the sun, so to speak, and particularly the Guard. The National Guard is very political, and most people don't realize how political it is, but you really got to be able to stay in the system, and I'm not one of those kind of people. So.
Now, you eventually though wound up doing something at the Pentagon, is that right?
Yeah, so then the last thing we did, the last thing I did was I switched to a program that was a bunch of lieutenant colonels and colonels who met in the Pentagon and did projects for the Pentagon that they wanted done but didn't have the personnel to do. And so they were happy to have this group of people, so we got credit for and then in the summer I because part of my doctoral business was evaluation and so on, so I would go evaluate a National Guard unit or something, and for 2 weeks while I were on their 2-week tour of duty, then I would write up their evaluation. So I did that for a few years. And then this thing then finally came to an interesting one, that what the Pentagon wanted to do. Now this is the Cold War, and during the Cold War, they knew that had it all planned out what's happened. So I'm going to give you an example of the kind of thing was that the 82nd Airborne in Fort Bragg would jump on the airplane with whatever they can put in their sack and head for the Fulta Gap, which was little plains between the swamps of Poland and the Alp Mountains, and that was the place where if the Russians invaded was going to come through. So.
It's like the Czechoslovak frontier, right? Not Poland.
Huh?
You didn't have a frontier with Poland, but West Germany and Czechoslovakia are next to each other, and that's where the Fulda Gap is.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
The Fulda Gap is that where you eventually come through.
That's the invasion route.
But you can't go north because you run into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
You can't go south because you run into trouble. So you know if the Russians are going to invade Western Europe, you know where they're coming from. And so they had this laid out that the 82nd Airborne would fly over there and land somewhere. And then the plan was that a whole bunch of artillery units, which were guard and reserve units from New England, would come down and occupy Fort Bragg and get some training in. Now, both of these units will have equipment in Europe that they're going to fall on. But they decided that they needed to train those people a little more before they went. So, okay, so let's assume that if the balloon goes up, that you got all of these people who are, and so the 82nd Airborne left. Now, it's not like World War II. World War II, when you cleaned out of the barracks, if you didn't have anything you could sell or give away, it went in the trash. But what would happen in the Cold War, 82nd Airborne have cars, they have civilian clothes, they have all kinds of equipment, and those buildings are full of that. And so it's easy to say, well, then the field artillery units will occupy the building, but nobody says what's going to happen to the junk that's there. And so the Pentagon said to us, we'll put you on active duty for a month, and we want to know how you would solve that problem. And so, and by having lieutenant colonels and colonels, well, you could go, you can say, well, we could probably rent some storage space. Let's find out what's available. Well, then you go talk to somebody. Well, if you're a colonel, you would talk to somebody who's a civilian about renting a place, possibility. You can talk to them. You send a private, you're gonna get anywhere. You know, I give you the time of day. You know, so we developed this whole process of what you would do, and found we could find enough storage space in near Fort Bragg that we could get that stuff out of there. But now you gotta get it out in 2 weeks because these guys are already coming down. We're talking about the Cold War, and you gotta get these guys in Europe as soon as possible. So you want them to fire a little bit, but then they leave their guns there that they brought down, and they go to Europe, and they've got already supplied with guns there that they've all on, and then they're ready to. And the 82nd Airborne is supposed to have a delaying action, if you will, because they can't obviously fight a real. And so they wanted to know what's involved in the process, and can you get that stuff out of there?
Right.
What are you going to do with it? Now, you know, one theory is send it all in a pile and burn it and pay them off after the war. but so we found enough storage space, and that we could. But see, the Army had never dealt with that end of it. They dealt with what we're going to do with who goes where.
Right.
But they never dealt with that, and they really wanted to. So they gave us a month of active duty to stay at Fort Bragg. And,
Now, roughly what year was it that you were doing that planning?
I don't know what year it was. At the height of the Cold War.
So like in the late 50s? Or?
Yeah, somewhere.
All right. So when did you kind of complete your service with the reserves?
Well, then I was still working with them, but see, they didn't, except for that one time, they didn't provide any active duty.
Right.
So then I always got signed up someplace, because they were looking for people to evaluate units. And I'd already had some experience in it, so I didn't have any trouble getting the 2-week summer camp.
All right. And did you do that during the time of the Vietnam War, or were you done?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And so,
And what impression, I guess, if you're evaluating guard units and things, those generally did not go to Vietnam.
no,
So they were still stateside.
right.
I don't know, what kind of impression did you have of the Army at that time, during that Vietnam period? Was it different than it was before, or was your job pretty much the same?
Well, I don't think it changed a lot from what it had been before. The Army got better at looking at the reserves and how they would fit in. You know, the old timies was, well, when it happens, well, then we'll have to do something. And of course, the Cold War forced them to say, we can't wait for that, like, for example, if you looked at what you had to do, when that bunch of artillery, which you're gonna need as soon as you can in Europe, is coming down, you're gonna take both sides of the interstate. No civilian traffic on the interstate at all. Both sides will be filled with military equipment going to Fort Bragg and so forth. And you can't ask people to come and pick up the car because nobody's going to be able to go anywhere. The military is going to have the whole thing stowed up. I mean, this is what you're talking about, the reality of what you would face in that kind of a situation. And it was very interesting, different. And these units weren't, but one advantage of those units was that you had enough coming and going, like into the reserve unit and the National Guard unit, that you had people, who had been in the regular somewhere and trained, and so that becomes a big plus when you're now going to go into, real active. You don't have a green unit. You've got a unit with various kinds of people, but some of them have, it's like we had an example. We had when I was at this outfit in Kalamazoo, civil affairs, and we had an old lieutenant colonel that he had been an artilleryman in civilian life. I think he was teaching in an 8th grade rural school somewhere, and the guy was always not up to what was going on. But I knew people that knew him during the war and said, when he took over and laid the guns on, they landed on the target. He knew how to get that stuff. That kind of a job he could do, He couldn't seem to do much of anything else, but, and that's what is the real plus, that you've got enough of these people who are kind of circulating through, who become, it's not like you did at the beginning World War II, which you had completely with no experience of any kind. Here you have experience of all kinds. Some of them may be sergeants, some of them may be company officers, some of them may be higher up, but you got people who know how the Army operates.
Yeah. And they could run a unit and get
Right.
things done. Okay. All right. Now, I guess to kind of close this out here, to look back at the time that you spent in the service, what do you think you learned from it, or how did it affect you?
Well, I don't know. I always, as you can see, I wanted to go. I could have avoided the draft completely, but I wanted to be involved in it. And much of I had was not traumatic, if you will, but rather the plotty kind of thing. And so, I'm one of those rare individuals who never went to OCS. And the interesting thing is, when I got my direct commission, they had a bunch of numbers left over that were beginning with 9, like the pre-World War II people, and they used those for West Point. And then they decided, well, they were going to, because the OCS all started with 01, and so they had these numbers, and so they assigned those numbers, this bank of numbers they had. Typical Army, they wanted to make sure they're going to use everything, And so I got a number that looked like a military academy.
So West Point, so people would look at your
So
your
they-
files and they'd
right,
think you
so
were
they'd see
out of
my
West
number
Point.
and say, oh, you must be a West Pointer.
Might have come in handy.
So it's, it didn't have the typical training for, very few people have gone through it. And you see, most people wouldn't, if they weren't getting paid, they wouldn't be interested. And see, most of my career was not paid.
Okay. So you were just staying with the reserves because you were interested?
Right,
Okay.
right. But see, I got enough time in and points in and years in that I draw a pay.
You got a military
I'm
pension.
a retired person in terms of pay, so. But I ended up almost, it was only about 2 or 3 years between my end of my reserve duty and my retirement at 60. Because I had, and as I said, even when but see, I think there was a plus for me by working at that Pentagon unit, and probably got a write-up from somebody in the Pentagon, one of the people that, we didn't have much to do with them, a few of the people did, but they knew what they wanted and just said, well, you see, if you got a bunch of lieutenant colonels and a colonel, you don't have to worry about the goof-offs and all the other people that you get. It's a completely different situation, which everybody is self-driven, works together, and so forth. And so it's what you don't find very often in civilian life or in the military, where you get people who are, and so, we'd having trouble. We had basically a person who was because this wasn't an organized group, it was just a group that who made the contact with the Pentagon. We didn't talk to the generals that were one of these projects done, but they just come up with something they wanted done, and I said, well, then often you get a bunch of colonels and lieutenant colonels to work on a project that because you can't free them normally to do that. So that was a plus for me, I think, to get in that. Probably ended up, that's probably the reason I got my last promotion, was being involved in that group. And I suspect somebody probably wrote a nice letter, and that was it. So.
All right. Well, thanks for a good story and certainly an unusual one. So thank you very much for taking the time to share it today.
Yeah, it's aren't many people have experience like I had.